Good afternoon. Welcome to panel 3 of our post-election conference. The title of our panel is Can We Knit America Back Together? My name is Dr. Ange-Marie Hancock-Alfaro. I am chair of the Political Science and International Relations Department here at USC, and I'm thrilled to host this panel for any number of reasons. Certainly, I think everyone who might have signed up to come to this conference really wants to know the answer to this question. It's not just been in 2020, but even 4 years before, and even 4 years before that, our politics have been fracturing. People have started thinking that there's no way to get along, certainly no way to remain Facebook friends or follow each other on Instagram or Twitter. And so one of the things we want to talk about today is really what is going to happen in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Can we knit America back together? What is the challenge for President-elect Biden? What is the challenge for folks who did not vote for President-elect Biden? And we have a wonderful panel today of both Democrats and Republicans, as well as scholars who are going to talk about this. So I'm going to introduce all the members of the panel, and then I'm going to start to ask several questions. And again, if you want to ask questions of the panel towards the end, please be sure to use that function, and then we'll ask those questions towards the end of the panel. So the first person I'd like to introduce is former Senator, I should say my former Senator, Jeff Flake. Jeff Flake served 6 terms in the US House of Representatives and then as US Senator for 6 years representing the state of Arizona, which is completing its counting as we speak. Senator Flake was the lead House Republican in the successful effort to restore diplomatic relations with Cuba and is known for his ability to work across the political aisle. He's also the author of Conscience of a Conservative, a rejection of destructive politics and a return to principle, and a contributor to CBS News. The second person I would like to introduce is my colleague Jane Junn. She is the Associate's Chair in Social Sciences and a Professor of Political Science and Gender and Sexuality Studies here at USC Dornsife. She's the author of 5 books on political participation and public opinion in the United States, and she's working on a new book on the gender gap in voting in the United States. Her research articles on political behavior, public opinion, racial and ethnic politics, the politics of immigration, gender, politics and political identity have appeared in numerous scholarly journals. The third person I would like to introduce is Mike Madrid. Mike Madrid is a co-founder of the Lincoln Project. He's a former political director for the California Republican Party and a longtime strategist with expertise in Latino voting trends and analysis. He's a partner at Grassroots Lab, and he is also my former colleague. He was a spring 2019 fellow in the Center for Political Future. And then our fourth panelist, and we welcome all, but we want to welcome our fourth panelist, Doug Thornell. Doug is a partner at public affairs and political consulting firm SDK Knickerbocker and is the head of the firm's political department. SKDK consulted on Joe Biden and Kamala Harris's successful 2020 presidential campaign. With SKDK, he has worked with the Brennan Center for Justice, the NAACP, and the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He's a former lead media strategist for the DNC, and he is also a top advisor for the Congressional Black Caucus. So again, welcome everyone. Delighted to have you here. We're just going to get right into it. Though Joe Biden won the popular vote, I think we're at about a 5 million gap right now in terms of the popular vote. So definitely a wider margin than Barack Obama did in 2012. Democrats did fall short in the Senate and they lost seats in the House. The nation is obviously deeply riven, even after the idea that, again, there would be this huge groundswell of support for Democrats. We've actually seen about a 5 million gap in terms of votes. Donald Trump has not conceded either. So the question for our panelists, I'll start with you, Senator Flake, and then I'll just kind of go in order for this one. What can Joe Biden do as president to help America move forward and to begin to heal a country which truly is starting to seem like a house divided against itself?
Well, I think he has to do exactly what he said he would do during the campaign. And I think a lot of us, a lot of Republicans were impressed that even during the primary, where it wasn't popular to do so, he talked about his record and history of reaching across the aisle. And if he does that, which he'll have no real choice but to do, because I think it is likely that Republicans will maintain control of the Senate. And if they don't, it'll be a very, very narrow majority that Democrats have. So he'll have no choice but to do that, but that's in his nature to do. And if we want to heal this divide, I think America needs to see, Washington work again. And I think that it's in certainly the country's interests. I think it's in the Democratic Party's interest as well to do that. So I hope to see it. And I mean, having just spent, time in the Senate, that institution, that body needs it. And I hope it happens.
Thank you. Professor Judd?
Thank you, Ange-Marie, and thank you all for being here. And it's an honor to be on this panel with our other guests. Let me just begin by saying that it takes two. So this question asks, what should Joe Biden do? But Joe Biden is only half of the equation. It also requires the cooperation of the Senate Majority Leader, whoever that may be, and also the Speaker of the House, and all of the minority whips and other members of Congress. So it takes two. It doesn't only take in our two-party system, it takes two, not just the actions of Joe Biden. So I'll just begin with that. I'll also say that and our other panelists will know maybe more about the issues. I'm a professor of political science, not a practitioner, but it seems to me on the basis of opinion data and how it was that voters voted, I'd like to look at it from their perspective rather than that of members of Congress and elites in Washington, what it is that people care about. And these are the things that Joe Biden and the Democratic administration, along with members of Congress, should all be listening to. And that should be to cooperate on policies that affect the coronavirus pandemic and stopping its spread, and economic stimulus to aid Americans who are out of work and struggling, infrastructure which can help to build not only for today, but for tomorrow, as well as increases and improvements in education policy. These seem to all be, relatively speaking, uncontroversial issues. I also want to just note one thing, and that is just ask all of you viewers out there in the audience, if you were watching television or your Facebook feed or whatever you were doing on Saturday morning, this past Saturday morning, and you saw the pictures, the images of people in the streets. When I first saw them, I didn't know what it was. I thought, gosh, these are a lot of flags. Maybe this is the Republicans. Maybe something happened. It turns out it wasn't. Symbols of patriotism, the flag, people dressed up as the Statue of Liberty. What were people doing? These were primarily people celebrating the election, calling the election for Joe Biden, and in many ways celebrating the continuation of our long and fulsome democracy. I wonder if the Democrats might not capitalize on this national feeling of patriotism. Patriotism and being proud of the United States is not something only for Republicans. It's something that Democrats can do as well, and that they have done so proudly. None of these were staged by any party. These were spontaneous gatherings in the streets, lots of flags, lots of happy people, lots of red, white, and blue. I think one thing Joe Biden can do to bring us together is to remind us all that we are all patriots, all Americans, and all supporting of democracy.
Mr. Madrid.
I think the main thing to keep in mind is that ultimately, as Americans, as voters, as citizens of the Republic, we're going to have to get back to a point where we love our country more than we hate the opposing party. And until that happens, we're going to be, I think, stuck in a situation where we're just in this kind of partisan strife that seems to gridlock our government and raise blood pressure, anxiety, and even the potential for violence and civil unrest. I think we're really getting to a point where the ability to bridge this divide has become extraordinarily challenging. As a practitioner, let me just point out one quick item, and I think it exemplifies why so many folks on both sides of the aisle have a difficult time grasping a better mode of governance. Since 1994, virtually every election that we have had, both midterm and general election, have either been a vote for change or a vote for divided government. 2020 was no exception. It's very clear that there is no mandate for Joe Biden to govern, nor is there a mandate for the Republicans to lead the country. What people were giving a mandate for was a mandate for normalcy. Is a very strong statement against the extremes of both parties, and saying what we need to do is get back to actually making the trains run on time and make the system actually work. I think the party that finally grasps that basic concept, a movement, frankly, away from what we have seen with the political strife and partisan warfare over the past 2 decades, will probably be the dominant party. Curiously, doing the right thing often has the benefit of being the politically right thing to do as well. And ultimately, I think that's the best way. Is good governance will lead to good politics. And if we follow that basic rubric, I think that we begin the road towards healing.
Thank you. Mr. Smarnell.
It's great to be on this panel. And I think this is such an important conversation. I mean, look, I think first and foremost is all of the folks who were elected or reelected to go to Washington in the House and the Senate have to remember that millions and millions of people are hurting right now. This pandemic has killed over 200,000 people, cost millions and millions of jobs, and really just disrupted everyone's life. No one has been untouched by this. And so I think that creates, I think that creates hopefully a sense of urgency among our leaders to really do something to start, to address the pandemic, so contain it, ultimately destroy it, hopefully put together a program so that people have trust in a vaccination program. Before we get there, encouraging mask use, having a large scale stimulus, maybe not to the same size as the HEROES Act, but somewhere around there, that both parties have indicated that they'd like to do, but for reasons probably political, neither side was able to do before the election. And I think being able to send that message to a lot of folks, working class Blacks, working class whites, working class Hispanics, men, women, children, everyone out there, that we're actually going to put aside all of our political differences and try to do something to get people back to work. And if you can't get back to work, to get some to get unemployment insurance for the small businesses that are struggling, get those loans, help state governments, right? Similar to what we all rallied behind right after this all started. And I think that's going to be an important thing. I think a couple other things just to remember is that, Joe Biden, as far as I know, and I tried to do the math in my head, but I think Joe Biden will be the first president who will come in, assuming that that Republicans hold control of the Senate, with split government, right? Split power. He won't have, in 2016, Trump had control of Republicans had all branches of government. 2008, Obama had all branches of government. 2000, so did Bush. 92, so did Clinton. I think George H.W. Bush might have been the last that came in where there was where we had split chambers. So what that means is, like, the responsibility isn't just on Joe Biden here to and Democrats to get us through this tough patch. The responsibility is on Joe Biden as our leader, but also now, I think, as Jane pointed out, Republicans as well in the Senate have if they have a majority there. There's Mitch McConnell. He can't just oppose everything. So hopefully, that encourages some efforts to work together. And I actually think some of the issues that we're staring at, there is a potential for bipartisan support, whether it's on COVID relief as it relates to the health issue, as it relates to the economy, potentially something on immigration, potentially something on criminal justice reform. So there are some areas, I think there are areas where both parties can work together. And I'm not going to say I'm really optimistic about it, but I do think we have the right person running the country to make it happen in Joe Biden. This is who he ran. He ran as a consensus builder, as a bipartisan leader. He didn't shy away from that. That was something that Senator Flake pointed out. That's how he made it. He won the primary that way. He didn't change who he was. He's run as Joe Biden from start to finish. And, I think hopefully that is going to, he's going to go in office feeling that sense of strength that he got elected being who he was throughout 80 million votes. And so I think he'll be able to, hopefully, I think he's the right guy to be there. Hopefully we've got the right people in Congress too.
Thank you for that. And you said something that I actually want to ask Senator Flake and Mike Madrid about, which is, how does, if the Republicans hold, so after the runoff in Georgia between, the two, for the last two seats, if the Republicans hold at that level, a couple of seats, not as big as it was before, what incentives does Mitch McConnell, assuming he stays Senate Majority Leader, have to work with a President Biden that he didn't have with a President Obama? Let's go, let's compare the two. Like, why would he work more with Biden than he might work with Obama? What's the difference now in 2020? Is it COVID? Is it, some of the other issues we're facing? So what do y'all predict?
Well, I think there are incentives, and Professor John makes a good point. It's not just on Joe Biden to cooperate, that Republicans have to do it as well. And I think that there are plenty of political incentives to do so. The legislative filibuster is still there, so 60 votes are required to really move legislation, but there will be a number of Republicans, Mitt Romney, certainly, Susan Collins, Ben Sass, and others who will, Lisa Murkowski, and others who will want to move along if Mitch McConnell doesn't. And frankly, I think he does want to, because he knows, if nothing else, that the country is ready for that, is expecting that. And I don't, excuse me, I don't think it's to the Republicans' advantage to have gridlock and put up a wall like they did when President Obama came. And President Obama was in a different place than Joe Biden was. President Obama had just been in the Senate for 2 years before he started running. He didn't have those long-term relationships that Joe Biden does. I mean, 36 years in the Senate, 8 years as president of the Senate, as our vice president. He knows this ground. And I think he'll have some willing Republicans. Well, one area too that wasn't mentioned that I think is important areas for compromise. There are a lot of Republicans who have not been happy with our disengagement from the world, from our not honoring either trade agreements or our security agreements. These institutions internationally that we were the architects of, we've kind of abandoned in the last couple of years. And many of my former colleagues on the Republican side will be much more comfortable with where Joe Biden wants to go there. And I think that can be an area, along with COVID response and perhaps criminal justice reform. Infrastructure, that's always the white whale that always seems to be easy, but it never is. But there are plenty of areas where they can work together.
Great. And Mike, I'm gonna shoot it over to you for your response. And also, I can't hold it anymore. I need to know what happened in Texas. Latino voters in Texas, particularly along the border. So can you wrap that into, kind of what you see as the kind of congressional presidential relationship going forward here?
Sure. Look, I mean, I largely agree with Senator Flake and all the other speakers too, where it's incumbent upon everybody to kind of make this work. I do believe that the political landscape is significantly different than it was in 2008. I think that the immediate threat, both economically, which of course President Obama faced coming in, and was actually able to get some stimulus work done across the aisle. But the health threat, the public health threat that COVID presents, I think the immediacy and the overbearing nature of these two political dynamics probably create an opportunity to at least get some quick bipartisan gains. But I'm also kind of, aware of the fact that Donald Trump got the second highest number of votes ever in a presidential campaign. And while McConnell lost a couple of seats, Kevin McCarthy picked up a couple too. That's another dynamic that we're gonna have to deal with. Nancy Pelosi deals with a very, very slim majority here, one of the slimmest majorities in recent memory. So I've never been of the belief that saying no for the sake of saying no has been a winning political strategy. I think that both the Republican leaders, the Democratic leaders, and the president are going to see political success in getting something done, in moving an agenda forward. Of course, they're not going to agree on a lot of things, but I think on enough things, there will be finally some movement. And at least there is the hope, because of the politics, that there will be a different direction taken by the leaders in Washington at this moment in time. So briefly on the Latino angle, look, what we're witnessing is a real transformation of the second largest racial and ethnic demographic in America. For the first time, Hispanic voters surpassed Black voters as, again, the second largest voting bloc, right behind whites. And they're going to grow at about 2% a year. What we're witnessing is an extraordinarily fast demographic transformation, unlike anything this country has experienced before, that is causing a lot of the tension, frankly, in our society and in our body politic. And I don't expect that will get better before it gets worse, unfortunately. Now, having said that, as the community grows, we are seeing it diversify. And that diversity, of course, is reflected in its politics. I also believe that we saw a breaking point where a lot of the economic concerns that have not been addressed by the Democratic Party with the Latino community specifically for many, many years are now bursting at the seams. And you saw a lot of Latino voters, frankly, faced with kind of a Hobbesian choice, which is, do I support a party that is openly antagonistic to me, my people, and my culture, but is at least has some semblance of a message around addressing the economic concerns that I have today? Or do I work with a party that is more tolerant, more amenable, but isn't going to be able to put food on the table? And that decision was what was made largely, I think, by a lot of Mexican Americans specifically. The Cuban American vote is obviously something unique, very easy to explain with the socialist communist message. But what we're watching, and the key demographic here with Latinos, is Mexican Americans through the Southwest. The numbers still are not good for Republicans. It's nothing to be happy about. These are still extraordinarily bad numbers for the second largest ethnic group in America. But it should be no surprise to anybody who's been watching this for many, many decades that this day was coming. And I think it should be a wake-up call to both parties, that whoever is able to speak to the hearts, minds, and economic concerns, most importantly, of the fastest growing segment of the electorate is probably going to be the dominant party for the next generation.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that idea about being the next dominant party, because Doug, I wanted to ask you, and then I also want to ask Professor Jun about this. Are we, even though, again, it's a 5 million voter gap, 70+ million did vote for President Trump. Are we in a situation where we are seeing some realignment? So in other words, the folks that are coming together for the Democratic coalition now in 2020 and going forward might look different than the Democratic coalition that Obama assembled in 2008. When you have this peel off of Latino voters, for example, or when you have women in the traditional gender gap, which I know, Professor Jun, you're an expert on, are we seeing a party realignment where the Republican Party is fundamentally reshaped itself enough under President Trump that these coalitions are different and they're changing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure if we really have, I don't know if anyone has that answer today, in the sense that, look, I think you can say, based off of the numbers in 18 and 20, that the suburbs have shifted now to the Democrats. Now, how long that shift remains is another question, right? But and how much is that sort of a reaction to President Trump's leadership versus something that they feel enticed to support by the Democratic Party? That's I think an open question. So I think we are seeing a little bit of a movement in the suburbs away from the Republican Party to the Democrats. It's not just a little. I mean, we're seeing it in a lot of places, right? I think with voters, working class white voters in the Rust Belt, you are seeing these folks who, had traditionally been Democratic voters, they moved over, many of them moved over to vote Republican. And again, the question here is, was this something unique about President Trump, or was it something about, was it his just mannerisms, his tone? Was it his policies? What happens when Trump is not on the ballot? Can Democrats win these folks back? And then I do think you look at states like Colorado, like Senator Flake's state of Arizona, New Mexico. You look at, some of these places, Colorado is no longer much of a battleground. John Hickenlooper won that going away. Joe Biden won that going away. It was just a few years ago that Cory Gardner won that state. Used to be a very competitive presidential state. Same thing with New Mexico. That used to be a very competitive state. Arizona is a very, it's a purple state, I would say, maybe, or getting to purple. We had Sinema win there, and Mark Kelly, the President-elect Biden. So some of these states are moving. I think Georgia is going to be a battleground state for a while now. I don't think Texas is quite there yet, but it's getting awfully close. And in some of these House districts in 2018 that Democrats were able to win, it didn't materialize in 20. So I do think you're seeing somewhat of a shift. You could also argue that how competitive are Democrats going to be able to be in a state like Ohio and Iowa, where Iowa used to be a battleground? Are those two states going the same direction as Missouri, which used to be the battleground? Now it's not competitive. So yeah, I think we are seeing a bit of a shift on both sides. I would say that as a Democrat, I'm feeling more optimistic about the future because of younger voters. They voted overwhelmingly for President Biden, people of color. But no one should get comfortable, and no one should sit on our hands on the Democratic Party. I think what we saw in Florida and some parts of the country with Hispanic voters, and other people of color, is that Democrats can't take any of these voters for granted. They've got to have a really a well thought out economic message that communicates and reaches these folks and really mobilizes them and talks to them about empowerment and building wealth and small business ownership and advancement. And I think those are the issues that Democrats really need to zero in on over the next couple of years, because it's not fully thought out as a party right now.
Thank you. Professor John?
Well, a lot's been said, and so let me just respond by saying that I'll respond to a couple of the questions, but I'm most intrigued by the question of party realignment. As you know, in American politics, we have cycles of realignment and change, and many of these things, people often think that they're driven by elites, and they are to some degree, but really party realignment happens on the backs of voters. It's not necessarily only parties leading voters. Voters lead the parties. Voters communicate with their votes who they want and what they want. And I think the jury is still out here. It's awfully early. We're still arguing about the exit polls and which ones were done properly. We're still arguing about pre-election polls and even the internal polls, what went wrong there. I think there are a couple of things to keep in mind, though. Remember that each election is a unique electorate, and that's not just a function of population replacement, which is to say young voters coming in and older voters leaving the electorate, but also systematic change over time. And Doug has just mentioned that with respect to the increase in voters of color in the electorate, now making up more than a quarter, more than in the future, even more than that. We also have to keep in mind the composition of the electorate by gender. Now I'll ask all of you panelists, other than the chair of this panel, who's the modal voter in US politics in 2020? Is it a woman or a man?
Say that again. Who's the model voter?
Modal. So the largest group.
Mm-hmm.
Is the largest group male or female in the electorate?
Female.
Okay. And how about Senator Flake? How about 1980?
My guess would be male.
How about 1964?
Male.
Wrong.
No.
Women have been the modal voter in American politics since before 1964, and they are now almost 54% of the electorate. So if you want to know where the electorate's going to go, look to women, because they're the ones that actually decide elections. I think you can see that in many locations, but all you got to do is look at the simple math. This is not a complicated SAT math word problem. It's obvious. When you look at the demographics of the nation, you can see that is the case, and it's always been the case. Certainly been the case in the modern period. So I also just want to take us back to the title of this panel. It says, It's called Can We Knit America Back Together? And as we were, I've got my computer here because we're doing this all by Zoom. I just Googled how many knitters are there in America. There are almost 30 million people in the United States that knit. My guess is that most of them are women. And I think what we want to do here is not only look to the future, but look to the present. Who is it and what is it that can bring people together? Who are pragmatic people that try to figure out how to make things better, how to improve education, how to create a stimulus, how to help ordinary people get back on their feet and continue to prosper, what to do about healthcare and children. And I would submit to you that 54% of the electorate doesn't want to see more partisan fighting, but would prefer to see a movement forward on policies. I think also, and this is going to pre-form maybe some of the other questions, I'd like us to also spend a little bit of time thinking about what young voters want. They came out in droves in this election, much higher turnout among young voters. And whether they're Democratic or Republican, these voters systematically care much more about and are ideologically similar on things like climate change, economic development, infrastructure, racial justice, improving education. These are all issues that 30 and under people in 10 years will be the base of either the Democratic or the Republican Party. So I just want to switch the focus over to us all recognizing the power of women voters in this electorate, and also to take into consideration the sentiment of young voters. They're the ones that are going to create the realignment.
Thanks for that. So speaking of realignment, we did talk about 64, and certainly Arizona was kind of one of the epicenters of the last big realignment of the 20th century. So Senator Flake, I want to come to you not to ask you about Barry Goldwater, but to ask you instead, you know, I used to live there. I love it. There is this Western resistance, though, that happens in a lot of Western states, not just Arizona, around kind of federal overreach and federal interference. And so I want to ask a question about coronavirus and masks. And so, you know, President-elect Biden has said that he wants to, as much as possible, encourage, bully pulpit-wise, but also policy-wise, the mandating of the wearing of masks. And so, you know, I want to think about, like, what's the likely reaction in Ahwatukee, Arizona, in Chandler, Arizona, in, you know, Yuma, where my ex-in-laws are from. You know, what's the if that's going to be a mandate from the federal government, whether it's CDC or HHS or someplace else, what's going to be, you know, the main response there? And then, Doug, I'm going to ask you the same question for a Democratic state.
Oh, it's going to be much like, you know, the old salsa commercial, you know, New York City. Why should we listen to somebody from there? Now, you know, President-elect Biden talked during the campaign more about, you know, providing leadership and huddling with the governors and others to encourage them to have mandates and not set one from Washington. So if he does that, there'll be a lot better reaction. Arizona has had a tough time with mask mandates. The governor has decided to sit back and let others do it. And I can't say that he's that wrong in terms of the reaction. I mean, I would just look at my hometown, Snowflake, Arizona. There's not a lot of mask wearing going on because there is this kind of resistance. So I think that the more that you know, President Biden can actually work with the governors, provide leadership, and have it still, you know, flow from local state officials rather than from Washington, the better we'll all be off, I think, in terms of mask usage or some of the other mandates that will help with this.
Thank you. And so, Doug, I'm going to ask you a question about Michigan, because Michigan is clearly a Democratic state, Democratic governor, went for Biden, according to the calls now, you know, for the 2020 election. But there is, again, this significant pocket of resistance that has been mobilized, right, to, you know, potentially even threaten Governor Whitmer. So I'm wondering, how is this going to play in a Democratic state, where, again, you might have the elites and elected officials who are all in sync with the president, but still there's going to be these pockets of resistance. So what are you thinking about Democratic states like Michigan?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think first of all, I think it starts at the top. It starts with the president, and we're going to have a president who isn't going to be throwing, fuel on the fire and discouraging mask use. We're going to have someone who is encouraging it, and hopefully, because Trump won't be on stage, Republicans in the Senate, Republican governors will feel a little, maybe hopefully feel a little more freedom to, do the right thing here in terms of encouraging mask use. I live in a blue state. I live in Maryland, and you go out and everyone's wearing a mask. And there's a Republican governor in Maryland, so I do agree a bit. I do agree with Senator Flake in terms of it's gonna, I do think to the extent it can be sort of come from the state leaders and community groups, that's going to be really helpful. And hopefully it becomes less partisan, the whole issue of wearing a mask, especially with the fact that, it's the single best way to stop the spread of this virus before we get a vaccine. So, and I do think, look, there's like $100 million. I heard that there's about couple $100 million that was appropriated to just do public awareness public awareness around COVID, around the issue of mask wearing. And, the Trump campaign hasn't even spent that money or not campaign, but the Trump administration. And so, I think that there's a way to hopefully depoliticize it and really encourage it, hopefully start with community groups, with churches, with people that are still trusted by folks by folks. Probably doesn't, I think, I don't even know if there can be a federal mandate in that sense. I mean, I think, but I do think if people think of it in the same way they think about wearing a seatbelt or smoke or driving, a speed limit or smoke, these are things that are for the common good, for the community. And, I hope that Joe Biden becoming President-elect Biden coming in and sort of turning down the rhetoric, stop throwing, fuel on the fire, encourage it, working with hopefully his Republican colleagues, that will make it a little bit easier. You're always going to have people who just want to be, who are libertarian and don't want the government to tell them to do anything. I get that. I don't agree with it, but that's always going to exist. But hopefully, his leadership will provide a sense of sort of a little bit of relief for folks to do what's best for, for them and their neighbors.
So I'm going to take just one little snippet of what you just said. I'm going to ask Mike about it because you said, throwing fuel on the fire. And again, I follow Mike on Twitter, so I've seen all the Lincoln Project ads. So talk about getting out there, right? And really, taking it to the Trump campaign. So I want to ask you, and I'm going to ask Senator Flake, and then I have a question for Professor Jum that's separate. Is there still space for the folks like the folks who led the Lincoln Project? So for you, Schmidt, Conway, the whole host of folks, is there still space for you in the Republican Party? What happens now that you've helped to elect President Biden is, I guess, the question.
We don't think so. Again, I think we view ourselves as traditional conservatives, frankly, in the Jeff Flake sense, who truly understand what conservatism is and what conservative principles are. The Republican Party has really metastasized into more of a populist nationalist movement, not unlike what you see with the National Front in France, for example. My strong suspicion is what we're going to see is that continue as the demography of this country changes. And I believe that there's a very direct correlation between sort of white identity, white grievance politics, and a lot of the economic transformation that's affecting society generally. And I think that depending on your race and your ethnicity, you are choosing a side in a political party to whichever party is speaking to that sort of tribal element. And I think it's something that's very profound. It's something very basic, and it's something very human, and it transcends ideology. In fact, I think it's probably one of the main reasons why you have seen a Republican Party essentially change everything that it believed in from post-World War II modern conservative movement until 2016, when a nationalist leader could basically say, we're no longer for free trade. We're no longer supporters of the international order that kept the world in check for the past 50 years. Russia is now a friend, not a foe. And to have the vast majority of the party follow really tells us something that we should be looking at. This is not conservatism as we have known it. It is populism. And it is also one of the reasons why I am probably not as hopeful as perhaps some others are, about the ability of the country to reconcile at this moment in time, is I believe that there's a wide swath of voters that are consciously choosing a path of not reconciling. They don't want to seek compromise because they believe that the changes that are happening in this country will make America no longer America anymore. And that's something that they are not interested in participating in. In fact, in many instances, they're more interested in tearing that down. As a result, the Lincoln Project, our approach, really began a year ago this month with one consideration. Are we trying to persuade people, or are we trying to shame people? And what we realized was there was not enough persuasion left in the Republican Party to actually move voters outside of the Republican column. However, what we did find was that we could move a small sliver, a significant enough sliver, largely of college-educated voters, both men and women, specifically women, but we actually saw more significant late movement with men when we started to take the tone that we started to use to basically ask people the question, do you really want to be part of the party that defends the Confederate flag? Do you really want to be part of the party that is rallying around a law and order message in the wake of the death and murder of George Floyd? The cultural issues are really what started to break Republican, college-educated Republicans apart. And the main schism in the Republican coalition to this day is directly correlate to whether or not you have a college degree. It's not gender, it's not race, it's not income, it's your education level. And college-educated Republicans are the most likely to eschew the politics of Trump and Trumpism and move towards a different direction. I would like to think it has a lot more to do with a basic understanding of what true conservatism is and has been for at least 50 years. But my strong suspicion is it's guided as much or more by a cultural sensitivity that rejects the politics of the racial dog whistling that we saw so prominently in the Trump era.
Thanks for that. Senator Flake, I'm going to ask you a similar question just in terms of, do you feel like there's still space for the kind of conservatism, you signed up for when it comes to the Republican Party, now that we're in 2020?
Well, I won't argue with Mike's diagnosis of the problem at all. I mean, I think he's been spot on. I would hope, and I still believe that there is a chance that we can, had President Trump been reelected, it would have been much more difficult. But having been rejected, it's a different ballgame. I'm one who believes that while the president will still have influence, obviously, on the party and on former conservatives, if you will, he's going to have more difficulty. When you lose the trappings of office, when you lose the levers of power, and so much of Trumpism is, more of an attitude than a philosophy that kind of relies on, this inevitability or this, this machismo, and which doesn't comport with losing a race like this by, 306 electoral votes, the same landslide that brought him in. So it'll be difficult. Now, there will be people in leadership positions or others who will still try to sing, his greatest hits, but it never goes as well. And I think the country is ready, and I think they expressed that in these elections, for more civil, steady, hopefully boring government. And that'll make it more difficult for those who would want to carry on, with Trumpism, a little more difficult. But it's not going to be easy. I'm not saying that, but I think it still is possible. And frankly, the president, while it's been just awful to see how he has handled this loss, part of me says, keep on there. The institutions of government are strong enough. He's not going to be in office in January, but it makes it easier for more Republicans, not all of them, but more of them, to break with that, and just to say that's we can't go that direction. So there's hope.
So thanks for that. Professor John, I actually have a separate question for you. I'm sitting here with my knitted actually Afghan. I want to talk to you about women of color. And, obviously we have one who has just been elected to be Vice President of the United States for the first time in history. But, Senator Flake was talking about, people want something boring. And I think about women of and again, think about, okay, what's happening now? They just want to be able to cast their vote and go back to living their lives. And so I'm just wondering for the future, how does that jive in terms of this knitting together with folks who Mike and Senator Flake have been talking about that are really ready to just like burn the whole thing down, like that sliver of the population that is like, this just cannot happen on our watch. Like, is there something reconcilable there between what women voters who voted for President-elect Biden might want and these folks who are like, this cannot happen?
That's a great question. And women of color do make it happen for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in 2020. I think that's clear. You don't even need to look at the exit poll data. You just need to look at the map. But let's go to the more general question, and that is, do women, as you said, don't want to have the president in their face all the time? They just need to get on with things, unload the dishwasher, load up the washing machine and get dinner on the table, plus work and take care of kids. Yes, that is exactly the place most women want to be. And I would maintain, and this goes back to something both the senator said as well as Mike, that the electorate is heterogeneous. I just want to remind you, so there's a small group of people, I think overall, the always Trumpers, who came out of the woodwork and who were influential. And I don't know that supporting Trump was the biggest reason for all of these voters. So let's keep in mind what the Lincoln Project was trying to do was center the Republican Party around candidates like Bush, McCain, Romney. These are the previous nominees of the Republican Party. Trump was truly an aberration. It was an aberration that ended up having extremely negative effects, you could argue, for the country as well as for the Republican Party. But it's not an enormous, it is an aberration that occurred one time. It was the black swan. So what I want to respond to here is to note that a sea change in party is not what we're observing. What we're observing is a small group, one Mike gestured to by talking about college educated voters and reminding them what true conservatism is. I think that what both parties have to do is speak directly to those voters who don't want to always be bothered by politics, need politics to take care of what it needs to take care of so that they can get back to their normal lives. And as a last corrective, I'll just note, Mike, that college educated white men still voted by a majority for Donald Trump, at least in the exit polls, vote cast in particular. So some movement, the delta, may have been larger this time. Nevertheless, white college educated men remained the party of Trump. However, white college educated women did not.
Okay. So thank you. I actually do want to come to Mike and Doug. I was going to go to Doug next, and then Mike, if you want to fold your response into that. I wanted to ask you all about, you've alluded a little bit to some of the racial tensions. So what should President Biden prioritize, and specifically prioritize in a way that might knit people together versus fracture the country further? Because of course there's a host of different things that have been going on over the past 4 years that have been almost by design fracturing to our country. And so I'm just wondering, what are some priorities on the issue of race in particular that might be able to bring people together versus separating them? So Doug, I'm going to come to you first, and then Mike, I'm going to come to you second.
Well, this isn't specifically on race, but I do think on the dealing with the pandemic and a lot of the inequality in our health system that people of color face. This coronavirus has disproportionately impacted people of color, both from a health and economic standpoint. But it's also hurt everyone, right? So I think that if hopefully that President-elect Biden and congressional Democrats and Republicans can come forward with another stimulus package that that helps folks who are really hurting. I think that part of the President-elect Biden's Build Back Better plan, economic agenda, has to do with dealing with inequality, both in our healthcare and economic inequality. And I think that's something that we were talking about, young people who voted this time around. Yes, they do care about climate, and they do care about debt, college debt, but just as a top line issue, they care an awful lot about the whole issue of inequality in our country. Whether that's racial, ethnic, gender, around your sexual orientation. I mean, that is an issue that it really drives young people. This notion that people are unequal because of something they believe in, how they look, or whatever. And so I think that there is space there, hopefully, I believe, to do something in a bipartisan way. Maybe take a look at there was the First Step Act that was passed and signed by the president. That was sort of a slimmed down criminal justice reform bill. I think they could do more there. I think that's something that hopefully Republicans and Democrats can work together. There's some components in there that have been already passed by many states. And so, I think that, when George Floyd was killed in front of our eyes, I think you saw a reawakening, and I think you saw Republicans, Democrats, also everyone in this country recognize that we aren't living up to the promise of this country. And I think as a person of color, you saw in the streets and you saw on your social media feeds, not just people of color, not just Black people outraged and angry about what happened specifically in the George Floyd situation, but just in general, you saw white people too. And it felt like a moment that was going to be enduring. And on the streets in DC and on the streets in cities across the country, and not just cities and rural areas, all over the country, you had white people, Black people, all marching together for change, and Republicans and Democrats as well. I think the president unfortunately took it in sort of tried to politicize it later on for his own campaign reasons. But that was, I think, a sea change in terms of how people looked at the issue of race and looked at the issue of inequality in this country. And hopefully it's something that we can, that it doesn't just sort of die with this election, that we build on it and we actually start making real systemic changes to how, the economy works, the healthcare system works, our education system works.
Thank you. Mike, you have an idea of what some things are that could be bipartisan when it comes to kind of racial tensions and how President Biden could move that forward?
I think one of the major challenges kind of afflicting both the country and really throughout the course of history is, if you look back, is where there's economic mobility and there's economic opportunity, you find that oftentimes, not all the times, there's always going to be exceptions, but you see much less strife. People are willing to kind of tolerate a lot more when they feel that they've got a lot more opportunities. And I think it provides an opportunity and a landscape where some of the issues that are really challenging this country could be discussed in a much more amenable way. And I say that because while a lot of what we focused on as a Lincoln Project were cultural issues, again, not to win a majority. Nobody ever said that we're trying to win a majority. You're trying to win enough votes in the right way to win an election. That's what practitioners do. We were very successful with that, right? And the way we did that, again, was on cultural issues. Had we tried to fight for the soul of the Republican Party, I think we would have probably taken a much more direct attack on the economics of the issue. I certainly would be doing that if I were focusing on the Democratic Party. And I say that because all of these cultural issues can be mitigated to some degree. We can debate on how much. If there was more economic hope, much more economic mobility, and a much more aspirational economic agenda. That's really what explains why Trump saw an increase in both Black men, though nominal, and Latino, particularly US-born Hispanic male, though nominal. Those increases were there. They were measurable, and it happened. And I think it was a little bit shocking because of the character that Donald Trump presents. But the answer, again, is very, very easy. If you ask these voters, overwhelmingly, the top issue, and it has been for decades, has been the economy and jobs. Neither party has addressed those issues. So if you want to unify people, first begin delivering on what they are asking for, and all those other issues oftentimes follow along.
So thank you for that. So I want to ask a provocative question. I'm going to ask all four of you, and I recognize that this is probably going to be the hardest question I'm going to ask you. So what should we expect next from soon-to-be former President Trump? What do we think he's going to do next? Again, I recognize no one here is living inside of his head, but we do want to think about what should we expect, and particularly in terms of its potential impact on whether or not we'll be able to knit America back together. So I'm going to leave that open. Who would like to start? Because I just feel it's unfair to make somebody start on that one.
I'll go last on that one.
I'll go first.
Go ahead.
Look, I believe that Donald Trump in the very near future will begin what I think his ultimate aims were in 2016, which is he will begin to launch a media company. And I think what he's trying to do is monetize this incredibly intense base of 73 million voters who support him and support him very intensely and intently. I think the goal will be to find some sort of remuneration from what he has engendered, what he has built. I think that politics has become part of the family business and part of the family operation. I believe that he will be a voice in the American right, probably for the rest of his lifetime if he chooses to do that. I think that he will, not necessarily because he wants to have an influence for influence's sake, but because he's going to want to monetize it and build a business off of it. And so I think that you will see the Trump name, if not his directly, one of his children, Ivanka or Don Jr., probably most specifically, that will be engaged in maintaining a very high profile, a very significant influence over the apparatus of the Republican Party. And I think it will probably be with us in some way, shape, or form for the next couple of decades.
Yeah, I would. I would agree with Mike on the media company. I mean, and I think he sort of now has his motivation or excuse to go after or compete with Fox News after they called Arizona, and he was, there are reports that he was obviously disappointed with the coverage by Fox News leading up to the election. So, which I'm not entirely sure how he could be, but. Look, I actually think that I just wouldn't be surprised if he just conducts himself as if he is the president of the United States. Like, I just wouldn't be surprised if he keeps doing rallies. He keeps sort of, doing the things that the president would do and acting as though that he didn't lose. It was a fluke. Doing large scale rallies every other week. He's got to figure out how he pays for it, obviously, because I'm not entirely sure how much, there's some doubt as to how much money he actually has. But I wouldn't be surprised if he just tries to sort of, keep that mirage up as a way to keep these folks engaged. And I think he's going to try to stall the 24 race on the Republican side from getting going. And I think, whether or not he actually does run, I don't think he'll ever announce that until very late. I think he wants everyone to assume he's going to run so that people like Marco Rubio and other Republicans, maybe Larry Hogan and whoever, don't get in. And so at least it stalls them. It holds donors back, political people in different parts, elected officials, other Republicans. So I don't know. I think I wouldn't be surprised if he tells everyone to call him president too.
Yeah.
I'll go next. I don't really know what the president's going to do. I'm a university professor, so I have no familiarity with the institutions inside of government. I'll leave these answers to the cleanup hitter, Senator Flake, to add to what's already been said. But what I will say is something that we can. So I don't have a specific set of things that he's going to do. I'm not going to predict he's going to set up a network or whether he's going to hold rallies or not. But I think we need to look for all of our answers in structurally what's available to him. Senator Flake said he no longer has the bully pulpit. He does not have free media coverage all the time. Setting up a media company will be expensive. So we need to ask ourselves, does he have money? Does he have the bully pulpit? Does he still have a fan base? I like to think of Trump as kind of a one-hit wonder. He's the Billy Ray Cyrus. Remember that guy? Miley Cyrus's dad, who wrote something called, or didn't he sing a song called Achy Breaky Heart?
Yes,
Okay, he's like that. Trump is like that in politics. He is a one-hit wonder. He was popular for a while. He shall fade in the same way that Jesse Ventura did and others. What surprises me the most is how many politicians, particularly on the conservative side or on the Republican side at present, are as afraid of him as they are. Now, I understand there's still a couple of months left, but I think history tells us that a one-hit wonder is precisely that.
Thank you. Senator Flake.
I think Mike and Doug are right. It's going to be a media company. I think the cable organizations have already shown us is that you can take just a small sliver of the population even and run a very profitable business just catering to that very small group. And he has, he's got a big group that he can kind of carry with him, a ready-made audience for whatever he wants to do. But yeah, it won't be it won't be free media anymore. It's going to be more difficult for him, but he will be able to exercise leverage. And if you want to know why my former colleagues are still, not conceding that he lost, is they do worry that he will have an outsized influence at least. And keep in mind, right now, in the last couple of years, in any race in the country, he could pick up the phone and generate a primary opponent that would take a Republican out. And I don't think that he'll wield that kind of influence in the future, but he will be able to control some of that in certain areas and certain districts and perhaps in certain states. And so you're going to have fear among a lot of Republicans for crossing him. But yeah, I think it's going to be media, and I just hope that it's the people are the bulk of the population are ready to move on. Back in the old times, back in the 60s when, William F. Buckley Jr. and Barry Goldwater kind of sidelined the John Birch movement, saying that we couldn't have this emblem of irresponsibility be a front for the party or have the party identified with that. John Meacham the other day said that was probably about, it's always been 10 or 15% of the party has been given to conspiracy theories and everything else. But John Meacham's supposition was that might be, 70% of the Republican Party now. I don't think that's that large, but it's definitely larger than 10 or 15%, and we'll have to be dealing with that for a while.
So, well, thank you all for your comments right now. We're going to open it up to the questions, and we have several questions that folks have been submitting over the time that we've been talking. So the first question, and I'll probably take one person for each of these. So the first question really talks about if you think about AOC's kind of logic, so Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's kind of logic, that may win the coasts, but Tom Cotton's logic is what wins the middle. And so the question is, are these sides too extreme? Should Democrats focus on working class people to get more Republicans behind them, who normally bristle at what they see as political correctness, cancel culture, and wokeness run amok? Or alternatively, or together, should Republicans focus more on things like climate change and social justice issues so they get more young people behind the party? So I think about somebody like a Rand Paul in that context, who has tried to embrace certain aspects of a criminal justice reform agenda, for example, right? Even though he's a Republican from Kentucky. So I'm just wondering what folks think. Are these two sides extreme for Democrats and Republicans to ever meet again in the middle?
Well, I'll just say, for Republicans, if we want to win millennials over, and obviously at some point demographics really do matter in terms of, I think millennials have been running away from the party for a while, partly because of our inability or unwillingness to accept that climate change exists. Now, I'm one who believes that we can have some pretty darn good free market solutions to that are better than what the Democratic Party has proposed. But man, we've got to admit that it exists and actually deal with it. So yeah, there are certain areas that we're going to have to as Republicans change. You know, I'll let somebody else talk about AOC.
Dr. John, I don't know if you want to talk about AOC, because the next question is going to go to Doug.
I have to agree with Senator Flake. I think that there are the clear, most of the evidence on issue positions of young voters, whether Republican or Democratic, environmental policy, climate change, green friendly, economic, as well as social policies are among the most important issues, along with, as Doug noted, issues around fairness and equality. I mean, you have to remember that young Americans are disproportionately, they're really not one group of anything. There's no one majority group in terms of race among young people. And so when young people are out there circulating amongst themselves, they're seeing everybody. And it feels bad to them that racial inequality remains as clear, with such important consequences for whether or not one can live after being pulled over by police. And so I think that on the left, maybe AOC's policies are considered radical and upsetting, as they were to some of the panelists on the previous session on Republicans, but they are the policies that many young voters believe in. Those young voters today, in 4 years, will be in their mid-30s. And in another 4 years, and another 12 years, will be at the height of their participation. Now, unless the issues change so dramatically, I don't think they will. And I think that will, by definition and by necessity, push the parties both in the direction of more progressive politics on racial equality as well as on the climate.
So thank you. Doug, I have a question here from Roberto Perez. He wants to know, what would you say to Democrats who believe compromising with Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell would lead to inadequate policy outcomes that do not meet the tremendous challenges facing us as a nation? I was a little surprised at the speed at which the postmortem has been taking place, and the fights that are going on around the slimmer majority in the House with regard to, do we negotiate or do we kind of stand firm? Can you talk a little bit about what you would say to those Democrats who are pushing for more left solutions at this point?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that what I would say is that, we didn't, right now we don't control the majority in the Senate. So in order to get things done for folks who are really hurting right now, we are going to have to find areas of compromise. Otherwise, it's just not, and it doesn't necessarily need to be with Mitch McConnell. I mean, it could be with a bunch of these Republicans who are up in 22. There's at least 6 states that could be very competitive for Republicans. And so I think, and there are others who've won re-election, Susan Collins and others who, I think, and who could be people who could, Joe Biden could work with. But look, in order for us to, in order for Joe Biden to get things done, we are going to be able to, we're going to have to find places of agreement with Senate Republicans. And our majority in the House is one in which, likely we will have to find at least a few House Republicans to help us on some issues to get stuff passed. Look, I would have loved for Democrats to have a 54-seat majority in the Senate. It didn't work out that way. We won, 80 million. We will probably win 80 million votes. But Joe Biden, we got to remember that Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination as basically a moderate, a center-left person who has a history of finding consensus and finding compromise. That's who won the Democratic primary. And he wasn't even close. I mean, people got to remember, Joe Biden won the Democratic nomination going away. He won it earlier than Barack Obama did, earlier than Hillary Clinton did. And the other thing, remember that he was able to reach out to Bernie Sanders, and there wasn't a lot of friction at all moving forward. And I think a lot of that has to do with Joe Biden's ability to work with folks. I mean, Republicans and Democrats, left and right. So I hope, look, there are a lot of big ticket progressive ideas out there that I really support. And I'm not saying it's not about fighting for those things or forgetting about them. But I do think in the near term, we are in an economic and health crisis, and we really need to figure out how we can work together to solve some of these, like, sort of generation. We're in a once in a lifetime probably moment, and it's going to require all of us working together and getting stuff done. And if Republicans don't want to get something done in the Senate, then hopefully they get, that's on them, and hopefully they find, the consequences are in 22. But before then, we've got to try to figure out how we can do something with them.
So, Mike, I want to follow up on that question that was asked to Doug with a question for you from Jeff Harris. If McConnell blocks everything President Biden and Speaker Pelosi try to implement, are there a handful of Republican senators who would be willing and able to work with the Democratic leadership on key domestic issues? Given the possibility of victories in Georgia, would 2 or 3 Republican votes be enough, or would it take 12?
Well, this is probably a better question for Senator Flake, but I'll take a stab at it. And I think he alluded to it earlier. I think there are 4 or 5 members, Senator Romney, Senator Murkowski, possibly Senator Collins and Sass. There are a handful of folks, I think, without the specter of Donald Trump hanging over their head, probably a little bit more amenable to working across the aisle. Look, the Republican Senate doesn't face a terribly good map in the midterm elections either. There's going to be a lot of defensive positions. And I think the impetus for them to get something done is going to be higher than it is to work to block Joe Biden at this point in time. Now, I could be Pollyannish about that. Things could change and change very dramatically. But I think at the moment, that opportunity exists. So the short answer is yes, that exists. I believe that it exists now. I think a lot of it will be dependent upon the tone that Mitch McConnell takes, is now the most powerful Republican in Washington again. And we'll just have to see, I think, how that shakes out. But again, for the first time in a long time, I'm a little bit more hopeful. I think, again, the voters have said something very, very resounding. It was not a mandate for the right. It was not a mandate for the left. In fact, I think it was a rejection of Trumpism. And I think it was a rejection of the extreme progressive elements of the Democratic Party. I think it's pretty clear what happened. They were saying, get something done. Let's get some reasonable centrist voices, as Doug just said, pragmatic people to make government work and get it done. Do your job.
Thank you. I'm actually going to conclude with a question that I'm going to ask of Senator Flake and Professor Jun. You all get the last word. So there is a question here from Jeff Harris. With very strong anti-establishment sentiments and movements on both the left and the right. So following up on something Mike was just talking about, what are the trusted institutions? Are there any left in our society that can help bring our nation back together? So Senator Flake, I'm going to start with you and then go to Professor Jun.
Well, for such anti-establishment, sentiments out there, we just elected the most establishment person, perhaps, that was ever put forward. 36 years in the Senate, 8 years as vice president, who promised during the campaign a return to the type of Washington that people actually fondly remember, who actually was in the Senate when it earned its moniker as the world's most deliberative body. So I do think, hopefully, the institution of Congress will again reemerge as a stabilizing influence. I think that Congress over the past couple of years has been pretty supine when it comes to letting the president do whatever he wanted. But boy, the courts and freedom of the press and these other institutions that we've relied on made it, and they're still there. And so I think that should give us all some hope.
Thank you. Professor Jun, we have 1 minute left for you to
I'm
tell us.
going to turn anti-establishment institutions. Let's not look to DC. People, let's look to the people. Let's look to the people in the states. I think the institutions that are saving democracy and that will continue to do so are things like secretaries of state, Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, nonpartisan officials and partisan officials who protect how it is that we run democracy. I think community-based organizations, churches, civic organizations, the Veterans of Foreign War, for example, the League of Women Voters. These are the institutions that protect and sustain democracy. It's not Congress. Congress has had quite a few problems for quite some time and always has. The thing that sustains democracy and protects it from anti-establishment and corrosive forces are the people and their organizations themselves, and the duly elected civil servants of the United States of America and all of its states. I think we're in good shape.
Well, on behalf of the audience and the Center for Political Future, thank all of you for joining us. Senator Jeff Flake, Professor Jane Junn, Mike Madrid, and Doug Thornell. Up next, we're going to hear from Jill Darling and Bob Schrum on the latest USC Dornside Daybreak poll. So please stay with us. Thank you.
But we're going to have about a 10-minute discussion here of our USC Dornsife Daybreak poll with the brilliant Jill Darling. She and her team run the poll. And I think there are kind of three interesting questions I want to put to her. First, Jill, we reported a 10-point Biden margin in our final pre-election poll. Obviously, that didn't happen. But we also had an experimental question. Can you describe it and discuss why it more accurately predicted the results?
Sure, happy to. So our colleagues, Professor Wendy Brune de Brune here at USC Saul Price and her colleagues at University of Santa Fe and MIT, they study wisdom of the crowds methods, and they have been doing so for some time. They used a social circle question that they have asked in the past. We've had it on our own poll in 2016 and again in 2018. And this question asks people sort of how they're voting and how their social circle is voting in a different way. So the way that we ask our question is we ask people to tell us how likely they are to vote for each candidate. The social circle question expands on that idea to ask voters to tell us what proportion their social circle of family and friends is going to vote for each candidate. So this question has performed really well in past elections here in the US and also in other countries. And we had our doubts this year, of course, because our poll with the 10 points, as you mentioned, was very similar to other national polling that we saw that was done in a variety of ways, both by telephone, other online panels, IRT, various ways. And so when all of the polls pretty much tell you the same thing, you get a feeling that that's probably what's going to happen. And the social circle question was much closer. So we were feeling like, well, maybe in a very odd election year like this, I mean, obviously, it's been said a million times, I'm sure, but you know, during a pandemic with an extremely polarized electorate, it's really a fascinating thing that this question actually has proved to be robust, even in this very different election. And I think we were talking about earlier that the latest projection, Nate Silver's projection, was 4.3 maybe in the popular vote margin. And so they're very close to that with their social circle question projection. So
I think they were 4.1.
Yeah,
so,
right.
So 4.1, 4.3. We've also just conducted a post-election survey. It's not entirely finished, but weighed to reflect the actual results. And two of the findings stand out to me. First, were there voting blocks that were primarily responsible for powering the Biden victory?
Yes, there were. I mean, we're still digging through this data. It's very preliminary, and I need to just say that about this at this point. We're still collecting data. In 2016, we found that voters younger than 40 voted for Clinton over Trump by 9 points in our poll at that time. And this year, they're voting for Biden over Trump by a margin that's at least twice that large. So that really tells us that young people were a real driver of the Biden victory this year. More than half of voters who are 40 and over voted for Donald Trump. We're seeing the same thing. I just was looking this morning at the numbers that we have, the fresh numbers, and you can say really the same thing about Black voters. Smaller group, And but the overwhelming vote for Biden in that group really powered as well, overpowered all of the non-Black voters who on average were just over 50% for Donald Trump.
So really, it was Black voters and young voters who created this margin if it does end up being 4.3%. And what percentage of Americans, especially Trump voters, lack confidence in the accuracy and fairness of the election? Because I know we've been asking that question, and I know you hate to guess, but could you assign any reasons for it?
Yeah, I mean, we've asked about the confidence because of the ongoing, rhetoric from Donald Trump and his campaign about fraud in the election that started before the election. We asked it a few ways. We asked about confidence in the vote count and the accuracy of the election. We started out by asking how likely they thought it was that individuals, groups, or officials interfered in the election enough to change the outcome. So really pulling it down to not just interference, but was there actual change? And overall, voters in general rated that likelihood fairly low, maybe about 4 on a scale of 10, or the equivalent of that, the way that we asked it. However, Trump voters rated that likelihood at nearly 7 out of 10 compared to Democrats who rated it at around 2 out of 10. So that average overall is really, sort of masks this extreme partisan divide. And we saw that as a theme throughout all of these questions that we asked. We specifically asked about the idea that the increase in mail voting this year allowed widespread voter fraud. This resulted in a split that was almost exactly symmetrical. 3/4 of Biden voters disagreed that increased mail voting led to fraud, compared to 3/4 of Trump voters who said that it did. And voters expressed a much higher degree of certainty that their own vote was accurately counted when we asked them, compared to when we asked about the accuracy of the overall vote count, and found that Trump voters' confidence in the national vote was very low, about 3 out of 10, compared to Biden voter confidence as close to about 8 out of 10. But for everybody, when you asked about their own vote, including Trump and Biden voters, it was very high. People feel pretty secure that the vote they cast was being counted, which I think that's really interesting. The other interesting part of this that I thought that, even those on the winning side of this race, their confidence in their vote was not 100%. There's the issues around the postal service, delivery of mail, and just all of the discussion of all of the potential for irregularities and interference, I think, may have just made people feel less than confident about it.
Yeah, and I think the president's constant refrain that the election was rigged and mail voting was going to let it be rigged obviously had a big impact on his own supporters, who tend to believe whatever he says.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jill. And we will have these full poll results out sometime in the next week or 10 days as we finish all the work on it. But we thought you might like a short peek at some of the most salient things that we've discovered in this post-election poll. Thank you, Jill, and we'll be back in a second with our final panel.